Okay, so today we're diving into some fascinating historical texts all about intellectual life way back in 17th century New England.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is one of these texts, it's called Text8. It's actually designed to help students, those getting ready for like postgraduate entrance exams.
Right, so we're going to kind of break it down in a way that hopefully is really helpful for our listeners who might be in that boat, like prepping for those tough exams.
Exactly. We've got excerpts from Text8 itself, and we've got a passage that analyzes intellectual life in early New England. And then there's, of course, some of those multiple choice questions.
Yeah, those can be tricky. So we're hoping to unpack Text 8, make it a little less intimidating. So our goal today is to really dig into this text, figure out the main ideas, kind of decode why those quiz answers are the way they are.
Right, and just get a better sense of how to read this type of academic English, which can be really dense sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. And we want to do it in a way that's, not overwhelming, more like those aha moments. So Text 8 gives us an overview right off the bat. What's the main point it's making about this intellectual life back in 17th century New England?
Well, the core idea is that 17th century New England was a pretty important place for thinkers, intellectual activity.
Mm.
The text specifically focuses on the ministers and the political leaders of that time.
Right. Okay.
And it begins by saying that historically, people have viewed New England as this key center for intellectual pursuits in colonial America.
So it starts with this kind of like generally accepted view, but then it sounds like it kind of adds some other layers to that, right? It's not just that simple.
Exactly. The text it peels back the layers, so to speak. So first it gives us this traditional view, then it considers the early settlers as people who were bringing their European culture with them and adapting to this brand new environment.
Okay.
And then it contrasts the intellectualism of the leaders with the more traditional beliefs of the ordinary people living there.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so it's like a multifaceted kind of picture.
Yeah.
Let's zoom in on that first paragraph then, because it talks about these thoroughly studied intellectuals, specifically those ministers and political leaders we talked about. What's the main takeaway for us from that first sentence?
Well, that first sentence really sets the scene. So when it says thoroughly studied,
Hmm.
that's like a clue, right?
Yeah.
That these people were important, that scholars have really spent a lot of time looking at their ideas. And then it goes on with that quote. Nowhere else in colonial America was so much importance attached to intellectual pursuits.
Right.
So what this means for you is that people at the time and historians since then, they've recognized New England as a place where thinking, learning were really valued,
Hmm.
more so than in other European colonies in North America.
Right. Okay.
And then it ends by saying that these leaders, established the basic themes and preoccupations of an unfolding dominant Puritan tradition in American intellectual life.
So there's a lot packed into that sentence.
Yeah, there is. So let's break it down. Basic themes and preoccupations. That just means like the main subjects they were writing and thinking about, the kind of core ideas that kept coming up over and over. Now, this unfolding dominant Puritan tradition is a bit more complex.
Okay.
So Puritanism, this was a very specific, very strict type of Protestant Christianity.
Right.
It was dominant because it became the main religious and cultural influence in New England. And unfolding suggests that it wasn't static. It kind of evolved over time.
Hmm.
So these leaders, they really laid the groundwork for how this Puritan way of thinking would shape American intellectual life as it developed.
Right, right. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Now, the second paragraph kind of shifts gears a little bit because it says taking this approach, meaning focusing on those leaders, those Puritan ideas, might make us neglect something else. What is that something else?
The text argues that, if we only focus on those intellectual leaders, specifically their religious ideas, their theological innovations, we might miss the fact that they were also carriers of European culture adjusting to New World circumstances.
Okay.
So it's a reminder that they didn't just invent a whole new way of thinking out of thin air.
Right.
They brought their existing ideas, customs, knowledge from Europe, and then they had to kind of tweak them, adapt them, to this new environment in North America.
Right. So adjusting being the key word there.
Exactly. It highlights that adaptation process.
Right. Okay. And then it mentions these ideals of civility and virtuosity. What did those terms even mean back then? Because they felt kind of, old-fashioned to us now.
Yeah, they do sound a bit formal, don't they? So civility back in the 1600s, they generally meant good manners, proper behavior, the standards of like a well-ordered society. So think of it like the rules for how people were expected to interact with each other respectfully. Virtuosity was a bit broader. It encompassed excellence, skill, often intellectual or artistic ability.
Right.
So the text is saying that these ideas, being well-behaved and striving for excellence, these were widely accepted as important goals in the New England colonies. They were widely understood as good things to aim for.
Okay, that makes sense. So then we move on to the third paragraph, and we hear about the impressive education and influence in England of those early settlers. Who are we talking about specifically here?
So this paragraph really emphasizes the high caliber of a lot of the people who came to Massachusetts Bay. It specifically mentions there were 90 or so learned ministers who arrived after 1629. So learned here, that's really stressing how educated they were, especially in religious matters. And it gives us a specific example, John Winthrop.
Right.
It says he was an educated gentleman, lawyer, and official of the crown even before he came to Boston. So these weren't just random folks.
Yeah, they were accomplished.
Exactly. Many of them had already achieved a lot and had significant education back in England.
Right. It wasn't just their backgrounds that were important, though, right? It was also what they did when they got to New England.
Right.
The text says they wrote and published extensively. What impact did that have?
Yeah, so they weren't just, keeping their ideas to themselves. They were writing a lot of material. And this writing reached both New World and Old World audiences. So people in America, back in Europe, were reading their work. This really contributed to what the text calls an atmosphere of intellectual earnestness in New England. This kind of like serious and dedicated focus on thinking and learning, and their literary compositions, their books, pamphlets, all of that played a big role in creating this atmosphere.
Okay, so now paragraph 4 gives us a bit of a reality check, right?
Right.
It says, we should not forget, however, that most New Englanders were less well educated. So now, who are we talking about in this other much larger group?
Now we're shifting the focus to the majority of the population. So we're talking about, the craftsmen, the farmers, the dependents, and the servants.
Right.
And very few of these everyday folks, they left literary compositions to be analyzed. So basically, we don't have many written records directly from them.
Oh, okay. So it's like we're missing, a big part of the story.
Exactly. It's like trying to understand a whole conversation when you only have, one side of the letters.
Right, right. And because we don't have those records, the text suggests that their views were less fully intellectualized and often had this traditional superstitious quality. What does that actually tell us about how they thought?
Well, it suggests that their understanding of the world was probably more based on traditional folk beliefs. Stories passed down through generations, and maybe explanations that weren't strictly based on logic or formal learning. So that phrase, superstitious quality, that implies a belief in things like omens, luck, maybe supernatural forces. And to illustrate this, it tells the story of John Dane, a tailor who immigrated. He moved from England to America in the 1630s.
Okay.
And his account, his story of why he left England, is described as being filled with signs.
Right. So his reasons weren't purely like rational, intellectual arguments.
Yeah.
It was this mix of sexual confusion, economic frustrations, and religious hope. And it all kind of comes together in this moment with the Bible. Can you explain that decisive moment for us? It sounds kind of dramatic.
It does, yeah. So John Dane believed that if he opened the Bible randomly, the very first line he saw would reveal his destiny.
Oh, right.
Like it would settle his fate. And the words he happened to see were, come out from among them, touch no unclean thing, and I will be your God and you shall be my people. So the text calls these words magical, really highlighting how Dane saw them as a direct command from God, basically telling him to leave England.
Right.
So it wasn't a carefully considered theological interpretation. It was very personal, somewhat mystical.
Right. And then the text asks this really interesting question. One wonders what Dane thought of the careful sermons explaining the Bible that he heard in Puritan churches. What's the point of that question? What are we supposed to take away from that?
Well, I think the contrast is really important here. So you have Dane, who makes this huge life decision based on this very personal and, as we said, somewhat superstitious reading of one single Bible verse.
Right.
But then you have the sermons he would have heard in the Puritan churches, which were likely very detailed, logical, and theologically complex explanations of Scripture. So the question kind of makes us think about that potential disconnect between the everyday beliefs of people like Dane and those really intellectual teachings of the leaders.
Right, so they're experiencing faith and religion in two very different ways.
Exactly.
Okay, so finally, the fifth paragraph introduces yet another group of settlers, those with slighter religious commitments. What does slighter mean in this context?
Slighter just means less strong, less important.
Mm-hmm.
So these were settlers where religion wasn't the main reason they came to America.
Oh.
And the text gives this example of a clergyman. He's like talking to some people on the coast.
Hmm.
And they actually made fun of the idea that they came for religious reasons. And their answer was, our main end was to catch fish, straight to the point.
Right.
And that just shows that, not everyone who came to early New England was deeply religious. There were different motivations.
Right. Okay, so we've seen this really complex picture of intellectual life, right? It's not just one thing. You've got the educated leaders, the everyday people, and then even those who are more focused on practical matters.
Exactly.
Now, let's look at some of the words and phrases that might be tricky for someone learning English. So when we saw thoroughly studied, that just means something has been examined really carefully, right?
Exactly, yeah. Like a detective thoroughly investigating a crime scene.
Mm.
And intellectual pursuits, those are just activities that involve thinking, learning things like reading, writing, discussing ideas.
Mm-hmm. And standard history, that just refers to the generally accepted traditional view of something. And colonial America, that's just the period when America was made up of colonies controlled by European countries, which was mostly England in this case.
Mm-hmm.
We had those basic themes and preoccupations, those are the main topics, the main concerns, unfolding that suggests something that's happening gradually, like a flower slowly opening its petals. Dominant means something that's most powerful or influential, and we talked about that Puritan tradition, that specific religious background.
Yeah. And when you see theological innovations, just remember theological relates to religious beliefs, and innovations, those are new ideas or changes.
Huh?
Neglect, that means it's being ignored or not given enough attention. Carriers of European culture, think of them like people literally transporting their way of life from Europe over to America.
Yeah.
Adjusting means changing to fit new situations, and circumstances are those new situations. Episodes are just specific events or periods in time. The pursuit of something that's just trying to achieve it.
Mm-hmm.
And widely understood ideals are goals that most people agreed were important.
Right. We also had civility and virtuosity, which we explained. Then there's impressive education, clearly a very good level of schooling, influence the power to affect others. Learned ministers who are very knowledgeable about religious matters. To have journeyed just means to have traveled a long distance. If someone writes extensively, they write a lot. Audiences, those are the people who read or listen. Intellectual earnestness, that's a serious, sincere interest in learning. And literary compositions, those are written works like books or essays.
Right. And when something's analyzed, it's just looked at very closely to understand it. Fully intellectualized means it's been thought about in a very deep, reasoned way.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's traditional superstitious quality, which remind us of like old beliefs and maybe some magical thinking.
Mm-hmm.
If someone emigrated, they left their home country to live in another one. An account is just a description or a story. Filled with signs suggests a belief in like omens or things that predict the future.
Right.
Decisive moment, that's a key turning point. Settle his fate means to decide what would happen to him. Magical words really emphasizes the power someone believes those words have.
Well,
Unclean, that's something that's impure or unacceptable according to religious rules.
mm-hmm.
And then, of course, sermons are just religious speeches given in church.
Okay. And finally, we have slighter religious commitments, meaning not very strong. Confronting, facing, or talking to someone directly. Folk just refers to ordinary people, mocked, made
Right.
fun of. Main end, primary goal. And illusory prospect, that's a hope or expectation that's not realistic. It's kind of like chasing a rainbow, It looks like you can reach it, but you never can.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, understanding these words in context is so important because sometimes words have different meanings depending on how they're used in a sentence. So you always have to look at those surrounding sentences to get those clues.
Absolutely.
All right, now let's tackle those exam questions. So question 1 asks what the author believes about 17th century New England. Option B says that intellectual interests were encouraged. Why is that the best answer?
Well, if we go back to that very first paragraph, it says, so much importance was attached to intellectual pursuits in New England. And that phrase, attached importance, is another way of saying that those interests were encouraged. The other options, they're not as directly supported by that first paragraph.
Okay.
For example, option A mentions the importance of Puritanism, which is true, but the first paragraph is more focused on this broader idea of intellectual interests.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. Question 2 asks what paragraph 2 suggests about New Englanders. Option B says that they brought with them the culture of the Old World. Why is that the correct one?
Well, paragraph 2 explicitly states that we can see these Puritans as carriers of European culture. Carriers, meaning they brought it with them.
Right.
So option B is pretty much directly stated in the text. The other options aren't mentioned in that specific paragraph.
Okay, so you're looking for the most direct connection there.
Exactly.
All right. Question 3 asks about those early ministers and political leaders in Massachusetts Bay. Option D says that they created a new intellectual atmosphere in New England. How does the text support that?
Paragraph 3 tells us that these leaders wrote and published extensively, giving New England an atmosphere of intellectual earnestness. So that phrase, intellectual earnestness, that just means a serious focus on intellectual things, thinking, debating, writing.
Right.
So they definitely helped to create this new intellectual atmosphere.
Right. Okay. Question 4 asks what the story of John Dane shows about those less well-educated New Englanders. Option A says they were often influenced by superstitions. Why does John Dane's story show that?
So remember how John Dane used the Bible almost like a fortune-telling tool to decide his future?
Right.
And the text even uses the word magical to describe those words. So this shows that he was really influenced by a belief that goes beyond logic, which is what we mean by superstition in this context.
Okay, so we're making that distinction between like a very logical, reasoned way of thinking and something a little more, faith-based, I guess.
Exactly.
Okay. All right. And finally, question 5 asks what the text suggests about those early settlers in New England. Option C says they came from different intellectual backgrounds. Why is that the best fit based on what we've read?
Well, throughout the text, we see this contrast between the highly educated leaders, the ordinary people who may not have had that much formal education, and then even those, like we said, who are more focused on practical matters, like
Right.
fishing.
Right.
So that clearly shows a variety in their levels of education, their ways of thinking, their intellectual backgrounds.
Yeah, it paints this picture of this really diverse group of people coming together.
Exactly.
Okay, so this has been so helpful in, really dissecting this text, understanding why the answers are what they are. But, if someone's reading this kind of text and maybe they're struggling a bit, what's one really simple tip that they could use to make it, easier to understand?
Well, one really helpful tip is to break down those long, complex sentences. Sometimes sentences can feel overwhelming because they have so much extra information crammed into them.
Yeah, definitely.
So try to find that main subject and verb, the core of what the sentence is actually saying. You can almost pretend to take away all the extra words and phrases, those descriptive bits, to see that basic idea. And once you have that main point, it's easier to see how all the other parts fit in. It's kind of like finding the engine of a car first and then seeing all the other parts connected to it.
That's a great analogy. Find the engine of the sentence.
Exactly.
Okay, so to recap, we've really done this deep dive into Text8, seen a picture of early New England with those intellectual leaders, those everyday folks with their traditions, and even those practical-minded settlers. We've tackled some of those tricky words and phrases and hopefully demystified some of those exam questions a bit.
Right. And, thinking about this, it really makes you wonder how those different ways of thinking, the intellectual ideas of the leaders and the more traditional beliefs of the common people, how did those eventually shape American culture and thought as it evolved?
Sure.
Because, this shows that understanding the backgrounds, the motivations of these historical figures can really give us a deeper understanding of these texts we're reading. It's not just about the words, it's about the people behind them.
Exactly. Yeah, it's adding that human element to, what can seem like dry history sometimes.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, this has been a fascinating deep dive.
Yeah, it has.
Thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you next time.
See you then.